So I think that the Liberal National Coalition in Australia may never get elected again. And for someone like myself who's quite critical of them, I actually think that that's a bad thing. My name is Nathan Ogilvie. This is The Rightest Leftist, the podcast for the politically homeless. And today I want to look at what's going on in political news with the National Liberal Coalition, or the Liberal National Coalition, as they're also known, because they are a mess and it's a real disaster. So let's just orient ourselves to who the Liberal National Coalition is and who's currently in charge. So the Liberal National are actually two parties that have formed a coalition and they work together. So the leader currently is Susan Lee, and her deputy is David Littleproud, who is, what they basically do is they have a deal where whoever's in charge, usually the Liberal leader is at this point the opposition leader or the prime minister when they're in power, and then whoever's the leader of the Nationals is their sort of second in command. And what's happening at the moment, if we have a look at the polling that's just come out from an organisation called Redbridge, is their numbers are a disaster. So I've got the graph here. I'll read it through if you're just listening. But basically, Labor actually have increased their primary vote. So in Australia, we have what we call ranked choice voting. So you get to select, you don't just pick one person that you want to be your candidate. You have to rank them all by numbers. So what can happen then is that the lower ones get kicked out, and then those votes go to another person. So that ends up what we call a two-party preferred vote. And if you have a look at the numbers, it's disastrous for the coalition, the Liberal National Coalition. In basically all areas, you can look there that Labor basically have 38% of the primary vote. And I'm just going to switch it over to quickly the results of the election back in May. So that's 6 months ago now. Labor's ultimate vote in Australia was 34.6. So they got a swing of 2% towards them since the last election, which rarely ever happens, because usually a political party will get in and they'll have that sort of honeymoon period and hype, and then they'll often, as we're finding, not deliver for the people, and people start getting fed up and they start to lose votes over time. But they actually increased their votes since the 2022 election. And now in this polling, just if you go by how things usually go, you would think Labor would lose support. They've actually gained support, primary vote, and are at 38%. The coalition are at 24%. And what is absolutely shocking is One Nation, which is Pauline Hanson's party, who she's a senator in Queensland, but they're all over Australia, has 18% of the votes, first preference, and that is huge. It doubles the Greens, who are on 9%, and then Other, which wraps up the independents and all the small parties, are at 11%. So the Other, if they were all one party, which they're not, would overtake the Greens. Albanese, our Prime Minister Anthony Albanese, is at 40% preferred Prime Minister, and really depressingly, Susan Lee is 10% preferred when you gather up the votes of about the same. So someone doesn't really have a preference, someone's not sure, or they say neither, that totals 50%. So most Aussies don't want either of the main two, or they'd be okay with either. And then Susan Lee has a disastrous number at 10% support. What's also really interesting is the favourability. So Susan Lee's only got 13% favourable and 34%, so a third of Aussies unfavourable of her. The grey is either don't know or not sure, and she's got a huge grey area. There's Larissa Waters and Pauline Hanson, which are the Greens and One Nation leaders. Larissa Waters, most people don't even know her. She's only got 6% favourable, 13% unfavourable, and Pauline Hanson's quite unfavourable, but she still has a lot of support from her supporters, and 32% rate her as favourable, 45% have her as unfavourable, so she's quite a polarising figure. But Albanese's, again, pretty polarising. When you're the Labor leader, you're going to get attacked by the right wing and the Liberals relentlessly. So to hold on to his numbers at 37% favourable and 39% unfavourable is pretty impressive, actually. The thing that I think spells doom for the Liberal National Coalition, and why I truly believe right now that they don't have a chance of getting in again unless they correct they steer the ship, which it doesn't look like they're doing. If we look at the generation breakdown, that's where the numbers really are a disaster. The Labor Party has 51% support with Gen Z, so an outright majority. And then that sort of goes up and down. But with millennials, Gen Z, and baby boomers, the Labor Party is sitting about 35%, give or take. But the Liberal National Coalition has most of their support with baby boomers and Gen X, at about 30% for baby boomers and 26% for Gen X. But then when you look at the younger generations, millennials only favor them at 23%, and Gen Z only give them 10%, which is just, I don't know if that's the lowest that, I mean, Gen Z have only voted for the last couple of elections, but this party, which is supposed to be the opposition party and was in power only a few years ago, only has 10% of support with young adults. So why is that? And if we look at the key issues, so these are the issues rated by most importance. So cost of living is by far the most important issue in Australia, followed closely by healthcare, housing affordability, and then closely after immigration, climate change, and national security. All things that I've been talking about on this channel. And if you look there at which party do people think is best able to handle the key issues, except for... No, actually, Labor beats the coalition. Sometimes it's close, like with immigration, they're both at about 20%. The coalition's at 19%. But cost of living, 30% of Aussie voters put Labor at best able to handle them, and only 21% able to handle the cost of living. And so really the coalition aren't winning on any issue in what voters think the parties could handle. And if we get down like immigration, One Nation wins in that at 27% of the population think they're best to handle it. And climate change, the Greens are there at 27%. And those two are the key issues for those parties. So that makes sense. But if you look at these numbers of the people that say about equal, none of them, or not sure, that's at about 30% across the issues. It's more prominent in housing affordability, but cost of living, 30% of Aussies select those. So that's where this kind of trust and confidence in the government overall is really low. But out of the major parties, Labor is just winning by far. I don't know what else to say. And so then we look at the data. I'm going to break it down generation to generation and have a think about what's going on. I do want to take note too, because my point of view where I am at the moment, the podcast for the politically homeless, is I think there is a lot to be said about the rise of the independents. And if you look, as we see in the generations, that burst from 2019 to 2022 for boomers, and you can see the generation years as they define them here. So boomers are anyone born between 1946 and 1964. They went from about under 15%, like 14% support, to 24% support for independence. It dropped the last election a little bit, but as you can see, coalition do pretty well with the boomers at about 45%. And you can probably imagine why, because that was sort of the era who grew up under John Howard. The economy was going pretty well. Boomers are often a really high rate of home ownership and personal wealth. You know, they often have their house paid off. They have savings accounts. They have investments. So the coalition's message seems to resonate the best with them. Labor still does 30% with them as well. And the Greens are they're about 4%. So the coalition is strongest with the boomers. They don't really have too much to worry about, although you could say they could probably do better, or Labor could do better with them, because Labor's got a slight drop off. But even so, baby boomers strongly vote for the coalition. Gen Z is really interesting because they're all over the place between going back and forward between Labor and the coalition. But this is the thing I really want to highlight. So Gen X people are 1965 to 1980. They're not. There's a generation called the silent generation, but they have kind of the I wouldn't say slang. What is it like? That they're kind of known, cliche maybe, that they're the forgotten or generation that no one mentions them. There's got like a lot of memes when they talk about generations and they just skip over Gen X. But you can see the rise in other spiking so high. Like back in 2010, 15% of Gen X would vote for the Greens, and now they're down to about like 6% support. And other has spiked up to, it looks there like to be about 28%, just under 30%. And that's kind of within the margin of error of the Coalition and Labor, because the Coalition have about 32% support and Labor have about 34% support. So the next election, it could go either way. And what's either going to happen is the Coalition are going to get it together and win some of these voters back, or they're going to keep losing them to other, because the big jump between 2019, other, so that's mostly independents and other smaller parties, were down to 12%, and now they're up to 28%. And the Coalition, would you believe, so that's the Liberal National Party, got basically 50% of Gen X voters in 2019, and then they just cratered. And I think a lot of reasons for that, especially with the Gen X, is they're kind of the generation now that are getting close to retirement. And I think they're starting to see, through COVID and things like that, the poor economic policies of the Coalition, that Labor's message of, especially Albanese, being the responsible people in government and stability seems to be what they're buying into. But we'll see how that goes. Now over to my generation, the Millennials, 1981 to 1996. A very interesting story as well. Over the last few elections, they've been pretty consistently Labor voters at about 36, 37%, so just over a third. And again, the other vote is actually the second highest in the last election. It overtook the Coalition at about 22 or 23%. And the Coalition's down to about 21%, and the Greens are at about 19%. So it's kind of Labor's way out in front with Millennials, and the other three are kind of all within the margin of error, following each other close behind. And the Coalition is tanking, because in 2016, they were for Millennials, got the highest vote. And I do think that may have been the year, because that was the year Malcolm Turnbull was on the ballot. And there's a lot to be said there, because he got royally screwed over by the Coalition. And they've created with Millennials ever since. And it's pretty much a straight line down. And I imagine that line to keep going down. If you've watched any of my videos, you'll know I'll never be voting for them. And I think a lot of people my age are catching on to how they just support the rich and the billionaires, and they don't actually support everyday Aussies. And look, Labor's holding steady, and we'll see what happens. My theory is going to be that I think that the independents will keep rising unless Labor deliver on their promises. And don't worry, I'll be keeping up my Labor scorecard in a few videos' time, and we'll be looking at how Labor are going with some of their promises, because I really think that's what's going to change for Millennials. Is I think the Coalition are going to keep going down. I think the Greens will stay the same, because they don't seem to be really changing their approach either. But I do think the other might take even more from Labor and become quite a clear second preference, because at the moment it could go either way with other, Coalition, and the Greens. But the interesting story by far is Generation Z, or Gen Z, which none of them watch these videos. I've got 0% of anyone 25 and under, so I can say whatever I want. They're not going to hear it. Labor, the last election in 2025 this year, got 40% of Gen Z voted for Labor, which I'm very surprised by, actually. I thought they'd be more Greens voters, and the Coalition and Greens both got about 26%. The Coalition got slightly more. It may be 27%, and the Greens 26%, and then others way down at about 6%. So clearly there's a few things going on there. The independent message doesn't seem to resonate with Gen Z for whatever reason. And the Labor message does, because Labor's by far the highest. There was a spike. So their first election was 2019 for Gen Z. And again, some of the Gen Zers are starting to be able to vote now. So the numbers it's not that everybody in Gen Z voted at the same election. So the data is a bit skewed. But 2019, the Coalition only got about 16%, and then it shot up to 30%. In 2022, and then back to this election, they got about 27%. So it's falling off a little bit, and Labor seemed to make up the difference there, with Labor going up from about 37% up to about 40% the last election. So if that trend line continues, and clearly I have no idea about the mindset of Gen Z, it looks like that the Coalition might fall below the Greens, and Labor will continue to rise. Because the other one on the Greens, so in 2019, the first year that Gen Z could vote, Labor and Greens were neck and neck with about 38, 39% each. It looks like Labor got 39 and Greens got 38% from Gen Z. and then it just flipped around and the coalition got more than Greens the last 2 elections. I have no idea what will happen with that, but I do think why the coalition are slipping back with the Greens is a similar thing, that they're not listening to the message of affordability. It's very clear, the photos of Peter Dutton with Gina Rinehart, who's Australia's richest person, is anything that they're offering in terms of the fuel discounts, tax breaks and things like that, they're just peanuts that don't actually solve the deeper issues in society that will actually help Gen Z to have a secure job, because they don't talk about AI or job losses related to technology at all. Housing affordability. This is the psychology of a generation that's basically being told you'll never own a home, unless you get lucky and inherit it from your parents, the whole dream of work hard, go to university and get a job. A lot of people are doing those things and taking those steps and not seeing it pay off, getting into lots of debt from uni and then being seen as an ATM from the government, because that uni debt increases every year. For some people, more than their salary increase. So they're actually losing out. And then the banks are not including, they're taking that they're taking the student loan and are not allowing them to have a mortgage for a house, so they're going to be forever renters. Really, the message from the coalition is we don't care. They don't even talk about it. They talk about crime a lot, and that resonates with some people. But I think Gen Z are starting to catch on that the coalition really offers them nothing. And what's happened lately, and the real reason that I think the coalition are never going to get into power again, is this whole thing of net zero. So I'm going to do a whole longer video on this, but really brief. Net zero is literally just when a country, their emissions that they create and generate equal the amount of emissions that they remove. So basically the country is carbon neutral or net zero. So the amount that we generate and the amount that we remove is equal. That's zero. Seems pretty logical, and the way the world is with every year getting hotter and hotter, because if we have a look, this is a graph of temperatures rising, the average temperature, and you can see there, this is measured against, which is like the Paris Agreement about not being, we need to not be 1.5 degrees Celsius higher than the pre-industrial levels. And as you can see, 2024 was the first year that we were at 1.6 above. And that's what climate scientists say is disastrous, because it's not sustainable and life will die out. We're already seeing the coral reefs being bleached by the hot temperatures, with the ocean levels temperature rising. And there's so many other climate factors that this is not a video about the climate. But the reason is the Liberal National Coalition have made the commitment to ditch net zero. And I think Susan Lee, and why I actually was giving her a hard time when she became the leader, and I'm sort of completely backing off that now, because she looks like she tried to take the moderate approach, take some of the lessons learned from the election, that most everyday Aussies are more moderate and centrist and want that. They don't necessarily want everything Labor offers, but they want a party that will work for the good of the Australian people, and net zero being a really basic target to meet, that we can discuss the timelines and things, but to just ditch it completely. And that's because of pressure from people in her party. I think she genuinely wanted to keep it and work with Labor on it, or at least work towards it. We're kind of burning ourselves alive on planet Earth. And I know there's a lot of right-wing slop and right-wing propaganda, and a lot of YouTubers and people who are anti-climate get a lot of funding from the fossil fuel companies, because literally the thing with that is it's dinosaur bones. Fossil fuels are a non-renewable energy and they're going to run out. So this clean energy transition is happening, and all the big companies pretty much know that, and they're slowly getting on board. But these dying industries that donate millions of dollars to politicians, and yes, they do donate to Labor too. So this is, never take my criticism of the Liberals to be an endorsement of Labor. They're need to do better as well, but at least they had the target for net zero. And so the Liberal National Coalition taking what's a pretty reasonable target, something that could be achieved, or at least we should be trying as a society to achieve, because we cannot go on with temperatures rising like they have been, with the last 10 years basically being the last 10 hottest on record, and the last two, 2024 and 2023, being the hottest 2 years on record, and 2025 being on track to be the hottest year on record. And the younger generations know that, and they worry about that because it's their future. And the boomers, I'm not saying that the boomers don't worry about it. I know some that really know, like, are aware of climate change and care and want their children and grandchildren to live in a world that isn't on fire all the time. But some people are blind to it, and I think a lot of them are propagandized and mind controlled. Basically, you just get that right wing slop fed to you, and there's some truths to it. Like, I think we do need a proper transition, and that's something the Greens tried to talk about in the last couple of elections, that it's not about getting rid of people who work in the mining and the fossil fuel industries to make them unemployed, but transitioning to those green energy jobs and more and a transition away from those fossil fuels is where the world is. It's what we need, and it is where the world is going. And I think they're just putting their heads in the sand to try and prop up these industries. Now, you could say that some of them genuinely believe it, but then you see some of these places that fund it, like Gina Reinhart funds the institute, the IPA, which is one of the ones that made a report about clean energy is going to take 1.7 Tasmanias of agricultural land away from Australia, and it's just a lie. And it's just funded by these right wingers or these people who they're going to financially profit from this clean energy being suppressed and focusing more on the fossil fuels and the things that are damaging the environment and the world. And look, this isn't my opinion. I think most Australians are fully aware of it, and they're becoming more aware of it, and they're starting to see the connection between these politicians who are taking the donations from those fossil fuel and big businesses, corporations, and then they're changing their opinion and votes on it. And then that's getting fed through the media too. And if you're in that sort of right-wing bubble, you probably don't believe in climate change or believe that humans have an impact on it. But we do, and it's getting worse. And it's a pretty reasonable thing to, even if humans have a small impact, to do what we can to make those changes. But, they prefer to line their pockets, I guess. Last image to look at, and it's a breakdown from the federal election results that happened again in May this year, so 6 months ago at the time of this recording. I've broken it down because that other is an interesting one when we looked at the different generations, and that report didn't contain the breakdown of where those generations voted in terms of other. But I've got here, you can see the independents, because that's where my attention is turned to at the moment. And in terms of being politically homeless, the way I describe it, I didn't get a chance to vote for an independent because there was none running in the election in where I live. But if you look here in terms of who actually grew as a party, so the Labor did get that 2% swing towards them and won 16 seats. So there's no denying Labor did really well from that election. And, Everyday Aussies clearly think that they're the best to handle Australia moving forward. And that's why, like, in the two-party preferred estimate, when you take all the ranked choice voting and break it down, Labor got 55.2% to the Liberal National Party's 44.8%. And that's just disastrous for the Liberal National Coalition. There's just no denying it. But the independents, if you look there, ended up with 7.4% of the vote. And so they increased their vote 2.1%. And as you can see there, they won 10 seats, and that was an increase of 1. But all we need for that next election is if the independents increase that again by another 2%, that could mean another 5 seats. And then they could be at 15 seats. And what I would love to see personally, because a lot of the independents run in areas where the Liberals are, and to be fair, the Liberals did take 1 seat back in Victoria from independents, so it wasn't all a good thing if you're looking at it from the independents' point of view. But what I would love to see in the next election is the Liberal Party to lose They're on 8. They got 18, so they lost 8 seats, so they ended up on 18. I would love to see the Liberal Party lose 5 seats to the Independents, and so the Independents up on 15 and the Liberal Party down to 13, because you imagine the shockwaves that would send through the political landscape if the Liberal National Coalition, and as you can see there, I should be really clear as well, there's the Liberal National Party, which I believe is Queensland. They lost 5 seats and ended up on 16. And then there's the Nationals as well on 9. So you have to add them all up together for the coalition. But the thing is, when I say the Liberal Party, that's where the independents run in more the inner city areas, sometimes in the suburbs, against the Liberal Party. So I think the Liberal National Party in Queensland and the Nationals will probably keep their seats. The Nationals often can lose to independents in rural areas. Like we've got an independent out in Victoria, in Indi, I think it's called, Helen Haynes. But I would love to see my goal, what I think should happen and will happen if things keep going the way they're going and the Liberal National Coalition don't actually listen to everyday Aussies and address the cost of living and affordability, and beyond just saying, you know, we need to keep fossil fuels going to make energy prices cheaper, when we know clean energy can be more of an initial investment, but over the long term, everyday people will save more. If they don't get that messaging right and actually deliver what people want, and I don't have any reason to think they will, because Susan Lee's, at the threat of her leadership, has just given them everything they want. Her party, the people that are critical of her, so she can keep leader. I think the independents will quite easily take back 5 seats. And when I say take back, win, because I don't think independence has ever been higher than 10 seats. They've won the highest that they ever have. And there's nothing to tell me that they won't win more if the Liberal National Party keeps going the way they're going, because those independents are mostly the Teals, and that's the reasonable Liberals who are still a little bit centre right wing. You know, they're still free market and capitalists, kind of like me, who still believe in climate change and know we could do more, and actually look at the clean energy revolution as the innovation that Australia needs. And that's where, with Malcolm Turnbull, who was the Prime Minister about 10 years ago and ran in the 2016 election, and that was the coalition's highest vote, especially for younger people, he got completely thrown out of the party and screwed over by Scott Morrison and the more right-wing extremists in the Liberal Party. And they've gone downhill really ever since then. You know, Scott Morrison did win in 2019, but since then it's been a bloodbath for them, and the Labor Party are dominating. And that's where Anthony Albanese is getting the nickname Chairman Elbow from the Labor Party to sort of, you know, mock, you know, his connections to the Labor connection to China and all that, that it's Australia is almost like a one-party state if it keeps going the way it's going, with Labor dominating. And I'm not happy with that either. You know, I'm not a Labor voter, and I haven't voted for Labor, and I don't plan to, unless my door's open if they really do deliver and they start to deal with the real structural issues in Australian society and the crises like the mental health crisis and the housing crisis, which, you know, at the moment, Albanese is doing the boring centrist thing of small changes around the edges, and that's much better than the Liberal Party would do in terms of making it worse. But I think we need a strong opposition, and if the Liberal National Coalition are not going to step up to be that strong opposition, then this is where I'm sitting. I'm all in for the independents to take seats away from them. Let's take another 5 seats as independents away from the Liberal National Coalition and be the opposition that Australia needs, because parties do get lazy. Labor will get lazy and not deliver on what they're promising. If they have no opposition, they have no reason to compromise or negotiate on what really needs to be done for the Australian people. That's all I had for today. Let me know your thoughts. If you're the Liberal National Coalition voter or supporter and hate everything I've said, tell me in the comments. And I'd love to I'm going to try and have some more Liberal National Coalition supporters on to talk to them. And I'm trying to start to get a couple of politicians or candidates as well. So hopefully I'll have a couple of those interviews probably next year. But I really want to keep growing this channel and expanding and learning more about the Australian political landscape. So my name is Nathan Ogilvie. This is The Rightest Leftist, the podcast for the politically homeless. And we will talk again very soon.